In the Kalahari Desert, there is a woman who can point to a cluster of stars and tell you a story her grandmother told her, which her grandmother heard from hers, in an unbroken chain of memory stretching back further than the pyramids, further than agriculture, further than the last ice age. And when geneticists finally sequenced her DNA, they discovered something almost impossible to comprehend. Her genetic code was older than the rest of humanity's combined family tree. Not older by a few thousand years, older by an entire epoch, older than the split between Europeans and Asians, older than the migration out of Africa, older in some sense than the very idea of everyone else. This is not science fiction. This is population genetics, and the story it tells is stranger, older, and more humbling than anything written in a textbook. To understand why this discovery landed like a thunderclap in the scientific community, you first have to understand what DNA actually remembers. Every strand of genetic code inside your body is a kind of manuscript copied and recopied across generations, accumulating small errors along the way, typos in the great biological manuscript of life. Most of these errors are meaningless. They don't change how your body functions, but they do something else, something quietly extraordinary. They accumulate at a fairly predictable rate over time, like sediment settling at the bottom of a lake. Count the layers, you can estimate how long that lake has existed. Count the mutations, and you can estimate how long a lineage has been evolving on its own, separate from everyone else. This is the foundation of a field called coalescent genetics, and it gives scientists something remarkable: a molecular clock. Not a clock that ticks in seconds, but one that ticks in mutations, and its hands move across tens of thousands of years. Here is where the story takes its first sharp turn. When small groups of humans migrate away from a larger population, they don't take the full genetic library with them. They take a fragment, a paperback, abridged from a much larger volume. Population geneticists call this a founder effect, and it means that every wave of human migration out of Africa, into the Middle East, into Europe, across the Siberian steppe, over the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, carried progressively smaller slices of humanity's total genetic inheritance. Each migration was a narrowing. Each new frontier meant fewer genetic variants making the journey, which raises an obvious question. If migration keeps shrinking genetic diversity, where did that diversity come from in the first place? And the answer to that question is not a place you'll find on most classroom maps. It's a stretch of semi-arid land in southern Africa and the people who never left it. For decades, the dominant story of human evolution was told almost entirely through a European lens. Neanderthal skulls in German quarries, Cro-Magnon cave art in France. The word caveman itself conjures images of Ice Age Europe, heavy brows, stone tools, mammoth hunts. It's a compelling story, and it's not wrong exactly. It's just catastrophically incomplete. Because while European populations were adapting to glaciers and short winter days, something far older, far deeper, and far stranger was quietly persisting in southern Africa, undisturbed, unbottlenecked, and almost entirely overlooked by mainstream anthropology until genetic sequencing forced the issue. The people at the center of this revelation are known by several names, sometimes called the San, sometimes referred to collectively, along with related groups, as Khoisan, a term that reflects their distinctive click-consonant languages, sounds that linguists consider among the oldest surviving phonetic systems on the planet. When researchers began sequencing whole genomes from San communities in Namibia and Botswana in the early 2010s, the results didn't just add a data point. They rewrote the opening chapter of the human genetic story. The first shock was nucleotide diversity, essentially a measurement of how many genetic differences exist between two random individuals within a population. Among San groups, this number was the highest ever recorded for modern humans anywhere on Earth, higher than any European population, higher than any East Asian population, higher, in fact, than combining several other continental populations together. Two unrelated San individuals, on average, differ genetically from each other more than two unrelated individuals from opposite ends of Europe and Asia differ from each other. Let that settle for a moment. The genetic distance within a single group of desert-dwelling hunter-gatherers in southern Africa can exceed the genetic distance between a Norwegian and a person from Beijing. The second shock came from timing. When researchers calculated when San lineages diverged from the ancestors of the rest of humanity, the number that emerged was staggering, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. To put that in context, the migration that eventually populated Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas didn't begin until roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years later. That means the ancestors of the Sand people had already been walking their own separate evolutionary path for as long as, or longer than, the entire span of time it took the rest of humanity to leave Africa and colonize every other continent on Earth combined. It's a strange thing to sit with. Somewhere in the deep past, a single ancestral human population began to split apart, not all at once, but gradually into branches. And one of those branches, the one that would eventually become the San and related Khoisan-speaking peoples, essentially stayed home while tens of thousands of years later, a different branch packed up and walked into an unknown world. But the story gets even stranger when you look closer at the DNA itself, because it isn't just old. It's structured in a way that hints at something researchers didn't originally expect: deep population substructure that existed even before that split. In 2019, a team studying southern African genomes proposed something that sounded at first almost too dramatic to be taken seriously: that modern humans may not have originated from a single ancestral population in one location, but from multiple interconnected populations spread across the African continent, exchanging genes with each other over tens of thousands of years, before eventually consolidating into the lineage we all descend from. Under this model, the Kalahari and the wetlands of the Zambezi region, now the Okavango Delta of northern Botswana, may have served as one of several ancestral homelands where early Homo sapiens populations lived, separated, reconnected, and slowly gave rise to the world's first true genetic diversity. It remains a contested theory, and not every geneticist accepts the specifics, but the underlying message has held up under scrutiny again and again. The single Garden of Eden model of human origins was too simple. The truth looks more like a delta than a single spring, many small tributaries of ancient population feeding into the great river that became us. And then there's the DNA that shouldn't be there at all. When scientists sequence sand genomes closely, they occasionally find genetic fragments that don't match any known human lineage, not modern Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, fragments that appear to belong to something else entirely. Some researchers believe these are traces of interbreeding with an archaic hominin population in Africa that has never been identified through fossils. A ghost lineage existing only as an echo inside living DNA with no skull, no jawbone, no burial site to give it a face. If this hypothesis holds, it means there was once another branch of the human family living alongside early Homo sapiens in Africa, contributing genetic material to modern populations, and then vanishing so completely that the only proof of its existence is a scattering of anomalous base pairs inside the DNA of people alive today. We have never found its bones. We may never find its bones, and yet, in a very real sense, it never fully disappeared. This raises a haunting question that anthropologists still debate quietly at conferences. How many branches of the human family tree existed that we simply never found? Fossilization is an extraordinarily rare event. It requires precise conditions. The right soil chemistry, the right burial circumstances, the right kind of geological luck stretching across tens of thousands of years. For every hominin skeleton that has been preserved and discovered, uncounted others were lost to scavengers, decomposition, and time. DNA, it turns out, may be a far more sensitive fossil record than fossils themselves, capable of preserving evidence of encounters and populations that left no bones behind at all. Now, layer onto this the linguistic evidence, because language tells its own version of the deep time story. The click consonants used in San and other Khoisan languages are considered by many linguists to be extraordinarily ancient, potentially representing a phonetic system that predates the vowel and consonant structures found in the vast majority of the world's roughly 7,000 living languages. Some linguists have speculated controversially that click consonants may echo one of the earliest forms of spoken human communication, though this remains firmly in the realm of theory, since spoken language itself leaves no fossils, and reconstructing its origins is a matter of inference rather than direct evidence. Still, the fact that these sounds persist almost nowhere else on Earth, isolated in southern and parts of eastern Africa among populations that also carry the deepest genetic lineages, is the kind of correlation that makes linguists and geneticists sit in the same room and start comparing notes. Cultural anthropology adds another layer to this puzzle. Sand hunting and gathering practices, reading animal tracks with forensic precision, understanding the medicinal properties of dozens of desert plants, navigating vast stretches of the Kalahari without modern instruments, using persistence hunting to run prey animals to exhaustion over the course of many hours, represent knowledge systems refined over an almost incomprehensible span of time. Some researchers argue that certain sand survival techniques may represent close analogs to the earliest strategies used by anatomically modern humans anywhere on Earth, essentially living techniques passed down across thousands of generations, adapted slightly here and there, but recognizably ancient in structure. This is, of course, difficult to prove definitively. Culture evolves faster than DNA, and no one can say with certainty that a hunting technique used today is identical to one used 80,000 years ago. But the deep genetic antiquity of the population practicing it adds a layer of plausibility that's hard to dismiss. So how does a population maintain such extraordinary genetic diversity for so long, while nearly every other human group underwent repeated bottlenecks? Part of the answer lies in what didn't happen to them. The San ancestors never crossed a frozen land bridge into an unfamiliar continent. They never squeezed through a narrow coastal migration route along the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, carrying only a fraction of humanity's genetic toolkit with them. They never faced the population crashes associated with sudden climate shifts in unfamiliar territories, disease exposure in isolated new environments, or the repeated founder events that come from small groups, splitting off from small groups, splitting off from small groups, over and over, all the way to Tierra del Fuego. They stayed within a region their biology had already spent tens of thousands of years calibrating itself to. And in evolutionary terms, staying can be its own kind of extraordinary achievement, surviving climate shifts, megadroughts, and the arrival of competing human groups for over 1,000 centuries, all without ever losing the thread of continuous habitation. Compare that to the genetic story of populations that left. When ancestral Eurasians crossed into higher latitudes, they encountered something evolution had never prepared them for. Seasons with almost no sunlight, environments where the body's vitamin D synthesis, normally triggered by UV exposure to the skin, became dangerously inefficient. Over thousands of years, selective pressure favored lighter skin, pigmentation allowing more efficient vitamin D production in low-light environments. It's a beautiful, brutal example of evolution solving a problem in real time, except that real time, in genetic terms, still means dozens of generations of trial and consequence. Similarly, when certain Eurasian populations began herding cattle and consuming milk into adulthood, a genetic mutation allowing continued lactase production, most mammals stopped producing the enzyme after infancy, spread rapidly because it offered a significant nutritional advantage in populations where dairy became a dietary staple. These are stories of adaptation, not superiority. They are the biological equivalent of packing different survival gear for different climates. And this brings us to one of the most quietly staggering statistics in modern human genetics, one that rarely makes headlines because it doesn't fit neatly into a which group is which narrative, but which may be the single most important number in this entire field of research. If you sampled genetic material from a single valley in Ethiopia or a cluster of villages in the Kalahari, you would likely find more raw genetic diversity than exists across the entire remaining human population outside the African continent. All 7+ billion people living in Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania combined carry, collectively, less genetic variation than exists within some African populations alone. This isn't a minor academic footnote. It's a complete inversion of the folk intuition most people carry about human diversity, which tends to assume that the more countries and continents you sample from, the more genetic variety you'll capture. The opposite is true. Geography, in this case, is a poor proxy for genetic depth. Time and place is what matters, and no population on Earth has more of it, unbroken, than the deep lineages of southern and eastern Africa. There's a particular irony embedded in this discovery, one that becomes clear when you look at how the history of genetics as a discipline unfolded. For much of the 20th century, genetic and evolutionary research disproportionately focused on European and later East Asian populations, partly due to funding structures, colonial-era research institutions, and simple proximity to major universities. This created a strange asymmetry. The branches of humanity that left Africa most recently, genetically speaking, the youngest branches of the human tree, ended up being the most extensively studied, while the oldest, deepest, most genetically informative populations remained comparatively under-researched for decades. It's a bit like writing an exhaustive biography of someone's grandchildren while barely mentioning the grandparent who made their existence possible in the first place. That imbalance is beginning to shift, and the reasons go beyond historical curiosity. Modern researchers studying sand genomes have found genetic variants associated with unique immune system adaptations, unusual lipid metabolism profiles, and even variants that may relate to longevity and resistance to certain age-related diseases, findings that simply do not appear when you study populations descended from smaller founder groups. Because deep genetic diversity functions like an enormous ancient library, sand genomes may contain biological information relevant to modern medicine that has been essentially invisible to science until very recently, simply because nobody thought to look there first. Several international genomics initiatives launched over the past decade have specifically prioritized sequencing efforts in southern and eastern African populations for exactly this reason. Not out of academic curiosity alone, but because the medical potential locked inside these genomes may be extraordinary and largely untapped. Yet even as this research accelerates, it carries an uncomfortable ethical weight that scientists are only beginning to reckon with seriously. Many of the same populations whose DNA is now considered scientifically invaluable have historically been marginalized, displaced from ancestral lands, and excluded from the economic benefits of research conducted using their own genetic material, a pattern that has played out in extractive research relationships across the world, from the American Southwest to the Andes to the Kalahari itself. Contemporary genomic researchers increasingly emphasize the importance of what's called benefit sharing, ensuring that communities who contribute their DNA to scientific understanding also share in whatever medical or economic advances emerge from that research, rather than having their biological heritage studied, published, and monetized without their meaningful involvement or consent. It's a conversation that's still evolving, and one that adds a layer of moral complexity to what might otherwise sound like a purely triumphant scientific narrative. Which brings us back to that woman in the Kalahari and the stars and the unbroken chain of memory. Because there's something almost poetic about the fact that the deepest genetic lineage in the human family, the closest living link we have to the population that gave rise to every other human being on the planet, belongs to people who have spent millennia developing an intimate encyclopedic relationship with a single landscape, while the rest of humanity was busy becoming everything else, becoming pale-skinned dairy farmers in Scandinavian fjords, becoming rice cultivators along the Yangtze, becoming altitude-adapted herders on the Tibetan Plateau, becoming city builders and empire builders, and eventually astronauts. One branch of the human family simply continued being profoundly, continuously itself, in the same general region where the story of our species began. This doesn't make that branch more evolved or more pure or somehow closer to some imagined ideal of humanity. That kind of thinking is precisely the trap that early 20th century pseudoscience fell into, and it led to some of the darkest chapters on the history of anthropology. Deep genetic diversity is not a hierarchy. It's a record of duration, not superiority. The sand lineage isn't a living fossil frozen in time. Sand communities today live in a modern world, facing modern pressures, modern politics, modern economic realities. What their DNA preserves isn't a snapshot of the past, and it's an unbroken thread connecting that past to the present, a thread that every other human population also carries, just in a more fragmented, migration-shuffled form. Because here's the detail that ties this entire story together, the fact that should stay with you long after the specifics of nucleotide diversity percentages fade from memory. Every single human being alive today, no matter where their ancestors migrated, no matter what mutations helped them survive ice ages or deserts or high altitudes, traces their maternal line back, eventually, to the same region of Africa where these ancient lineages first branched apart. Somewhere in the deep, layered mathematics of mitochondrial DNA, your line and the sand lineage share a common root. Their branch simply stayed closer to that root for 100,000 years longer than yours did. That's not distance. That's not difference in the way we usually think about difference. It's closeness, measured in a currency most of us never learned to count in, the currency of time. And it means that when you look at a genetic map of humanity, stretching from the Kalahari to the Arctic Circle, from the Andes to the Himalayas, you're not looking at separate stories at all. You're looking at a single story written by one restless species in a language it took science 200,000 years to begin learning how to read.